Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. In today's video, I'm going to be painting this Space Wolf Terminator. And this miniature is quite special as it's been expertly converted for me by the incredibly talented Amphiaris, otherwise known as Barry Watkins. Some of you have been on the Patreon a little while might be familiar with his work from the custom sculpted Dante videos. I reached out to Barry around the Leviathan launch about wanting to do a Space Wolves video, and I wondered if he was available to do some conversion work for me on one of the new Terminators. The idea was to do something based on this piece of artwork from Forge World in the scheme of Bran Redmore's great company. Barry was very kind and managed to find a bit of time to work on this. It's a fairly simple conversion for sure, but the quality of the work that he carried out was perfect for the job, and it turned out way better than I originally imagined or would have the skill to achieve myself. So a massive thank you to Barry for sorting me out with this, and if anyone's looking for some top-notch sculpting work, then check him out. I'll put a link into the description below. Now, I've painted a good few Space Wolves over the years whilst working for Heavy Metal, and this one was actually painted whilst I was part of the Heavy Metal team for a White Dwarf article around the initial release of the Primaris Space Marines. And I think it came out pretty good overall. The face in particular I remember being quite happy with at the time. But I think looking back now, I could definitely see that the armor was a little bit flat and basic compared to how I might tackle it nowadays, at least for a display level piece. So in today's video, I wanted to explore how we can take a standard edge highlighted Heavy Metal style Space Marine to the next level, still keeping everything quite neat and precise, which is typical of the style, but also push the lighting and shading much further. In fact, both of these paint jobs, the older Space Wolf and this newer Terminator, both use the same exact recipe. However, it's the application of the paint which has such a dramatically different effect, and it really starts to make a much more interesting final result. So there's two types of highlights that have been applied to this miniature, the standard precise edge highlight technique, as well as the much broader and softer blends to help give volume to the shapes of the armor. And this I'll focus on later on in the video, but for now, let's get started with the basics. So first of all, I base coated the whole miniature using rust grey, and this was over a coat of Vallejo black primer. This was also applied through the airbrush. I'm applying this in a few thinner layers to get a nice smooth and consistent base coat. I'm really going for maximum smoothness with this paint job, so it's very important to get this stage right, and the airbrush just helps me to do this easily and efficiently. Whilst I had the airbrush, I decided to quickly block out the white shoulder pad using an off-white. There was a little bit of overspray here, but that could be easily tidied up by brush afterwards. Once that was done, I went on to block out everything that isn't armor using a coat of AK black, and this just helps to keep everything neat and tidy, and I find it much easier to focus on the armor. Now for the shading on the armor, I'm going to start off exactly the same way that I would for the simpler method, and that's with a line shade of 1:1 Rhinox hide and the fang. And I'm thinning this a little bit with some water, just enough so that it helps it to flow into the recesses, while still being fairly opaque with 1 or 2 passes. I would also recommend using a good sized brush for this, as it just means you won't be constantly refilling it, and I think this one was around a size 1 rosemary. This shading creates a really nice warm purple tone that works incredibly well with the colder pastel blues. And this colour was great to add some more graduated shading later on. But for now, just carefully lining this into all of the recesses, instead of washing the entire miniature, ensures that I get a nice defining line between all of the panels, and it also keeps it neat and minimises any tidying up afterwards. Now onto the glaze shading stage, and this is really up to you whether you want to do this or not, as it does add quite a bit of time, but it is quite essential for that high contrast look. This requires a bit of patience and a thin glaze consistency paint, and I'm using the brush to push this into the lower parts of the panels. It's important when applying a glaze not to overload your brush, so you can wick off any excess moisture on the side of your hand or onto a paper towel. I noticed with this paint that it requires a bit of patience and quite a few glazes to get a smooth transition, and this is something that can vary a lot between different colours and paint brands. By building up the colour slowly with the glaze and trying not to let the shading pool too much like a wash, I was able to get a fairly smooth result. However, a little bit of glazing back with the rust grey base coat is often required to further smooth out the transitions, as you'll see later on. So try not to worry too much if it's not completely smooth to begin with, as this will be solved during the tidy up stage. The glaze will take a few moments to dry before it's safe to add another layer on top. I'm just working around every panel and surface here, and then by the time I've done that, the first surface should be dry again and ready for another application. With the shading established, I could now glaze back and tidy up any areas that were a bit too messy or the transitions weren't yet smooth enough. Again, keeping this quite thin and applying it over a couple of coats. Now you can go back and forth here between the base coat and the shade as many times as you need in order to get it smooth. And whilst it does take a bit of patience working with glazes like this, the result is that we can get a nice smooth transition without any build up of a thick paint on the surface. And for display painting, this is really important. Now onto the highlight stage, and because I'd already pushed the bottom of the panels quite a bit darker, I started off with a mix of the base coat plus Fenrisian grey instead of jumping straight to pure Fenrisian grey, as I was worried that it would be a bit too harsh on these areas. If you aren't adding a graduated shading like I have, then you could always start straight from Fenrisian as the recipe suggests. In fact, the original Heavy Metal recipe is pretty quick to do as there's only really 2 highlight stages. So I'd recommend following that if you're doing this for an army, as the end result is still going to look fantastic. Now there's nothing too complicated here, I'm just trying to keep a smooth, consistent, chunky highlight around all of the panels at roughly 2 or so times the thickness of the final highlights. And you might have to apply this a couple of times in order to get an opaque line. I also tend to use a much larger brush for this, again sticking with a size 1 rosemary instead of a much finer one for the final sharp highlights. It's also important to thin the paint a little here with some water so that I don't build up any physical texture, whereas for the final sharper highlights I'll tend to barely thin this, mostly because it's not going to show the texture as much, it's quicker, and let's be honest, it's much more difficult to paint the final sharp highlights, so I want to minimize the amount of passes that I have to do. Now I did start to work up to pure Fenrisian grey, especially towards the top of the armour panels and any areas that were going to catch more of the light. Now once the first edge highlights were established, this is when I started to add the softer blended highlights onto the armour panels. And this part took quite a while, mainly building up the paint in very thin layers. Again, I added increasing amounts of Fenrisian grey into the base paint and used it to pick out places where I thought the light would be reflecting. I often find it's really useful to take a picture of the miniature at the start of the project, either as grey plastic or also when it's primed black, so that I can see where these reflections might be. And this is really useful for giving an idea of where to place them, and of course then you can decide to accentuate them depending on the finished effect that you want. Something else that I've discovered can work quite well is this kind of micro stippling technique, and this can be useful for especially awkward and chalky paints. Still using a glaze consistency paint, I can flatten out the tip of the brush and use this to very lightly stipple the surface and build up the colour over a few layers. Depending on how many layers I added, this made the stippled texture not as noticeable and resulted in a very smooth transition, basically like building up lots of tiny transparent dots and tricking the eye into thinking it's a smooth and natural looking transition. And I found this a very useful technique for smoothing out blends. And of course you can combine this with normal glazes over these blends to get a very smooth finish. Okay, so with that done, it was now time to start to add some chips and scratches to the armor. Maybe it's just because I'm used to seeing this on Space Wolves, but it feels incomplete without them, and let's be honest, it looks great on this pale blue armor. So to do this, I simply use the same highlight color around the legs, the edges of the armor panels, and the power fist, and it just so happens that these scratches stand out really nicely on these more heavily shaded areas. Now it was time to add the final sharpest edge highlight using Blue Horror, and this is normally when I'll switch to the sharpest brush that I have for a bit more control, whether that's a Winsor & Newton miniature or a Rosemary size 2.0. But really you can use any size brush with a nice sharp tip that you feel comfortable with. These Terminators have lovely sharp edges, so this often makes it much easier, and if you can get a nice clean highlight using the side of the brush, then you should definitely do this. I'm a bit more restricted during the filming process, but you don't have the same limitation as me, and you should feel free to move the parts around so that you can get a more comfortable angle. And like I was saying earlier, I try not to water down this paint too much, but I do have a slightly damp brush when I refill the tip of the brush, and this is the perfect amount of moisture to keep the paint flowing onto the edge, and not thinning it too much means that it can be done in 1 or 2 passes. At the same time here, I'm also adding further highlights to the scratches and focusing the Blue Horror towards the outer edge of the armor where the scratch is going to be the deepest. With the final edge highlights now done, I could then go on to brighten up the reflections with some Blue Horror, followed by adding a touch of AK white into this for the very brightest point. I then went on to add some depth to the scratches with some Rhinox hide, and this was applied above the scratch. You can vary the depth of these, especially on more blended areas, by adding some of the fang into the Rhinox so that it's not quite so harsh. It makes a lot of sense to me that you would naturally get some variation and depth to these scratches, so you don't have to apply this stage to every single scratch and chip. Now I went on to add some rusty streaks from some of these scratches and around the recesses of the bottom of the legs and feet. This was done with some very thinned down Mournfang brown. This orangey brown complements the blue perfectly, and it's just a nice little subtle detail which adds to the story of the miniature. And that's about it for this video. I think just the armor for this was worth a specific video on the topic. However, I will continue with the other elements in the next part, so I look forward to catching you again very soon.